The morning they froze my bank accounts, I was still wearing his ring. Not because I wanted to. Because I hadn't found the strength to take it off yet. 9 years of my life were spent on that finger, and 9 years doesn't come off easy, no matter how badly it deserves to. My name is Elena. I built a company from a garage with a leaking roof and a space heater that only worked if you kicked it twice. I built it with a man named Arthur. We were partners in everything: the business, the bed, the future we swore we'd share. And on a Tuesday morning in April, with my coffee still too hot to drink, Arthur Vance had his lawyers legally erase me from the company I created. He used something called a shotgun clause. Buried on page 211 of our corporate charter, a clause we signed back when we were young and stupid and thought love meant we'd never need protection from each other. It gave one partner the right to force a buyout of the other, instantly, without warning, without mercy, as long as the price offered was fair market value. Arthur set the price himself. Then he triggered the clause before I even finished my coffee. By 9 a.m., I didn't own a single share of the company I built with my own hands. By 10, my personal accounts were frozen, apparently tied up in transitional liquidity holds. According to a bank representative who sounded like she was reading from a script written by someone who felt nothing. By noon, I was standing outside my own building, badge deactivated, staring at a security guard who wouldn't meet my eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. "I have instructions." Instructions from the man I almost married. I want you to understand something before this story goes any further. I am not someone who cries easily. I didn't cry that day either. I just stood on the sidewalk in my heels, Nandlaser, in my absolute disbelief, and I laughed. A short, ugly laugh, because it was either that or scream. Because here's the thing about people like Arthur Vance. They don't just want to win. They want you to watch them win. They want you humiliated, small, and grateful for whatever scraps they decide to toss you afterward. He didn't know yet that he'd made one mistake, a small one, the kind of mistake that doesn't look like anything at all until it becomes everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started. Arthur and I met in graduate school, in a coding lab that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition. He was magnetic in that dangerous way, the kind of charm that makes you forget to ask hard questions. I was the one who understood the algorithms. He was the one who understood people, or at least understood how to use them. We built the company together. I wrote the core architecture, the actual intellectual property that made our software work, patent by patent, line by line, at 2 a.m. while Arthur slept beside me and dreamed about IPOs. He handled the pitch decks, the handshakes, the relationships with investors who liked his confidence more than they understood my code. It worked for a while in the exhausting way these things work. We grew from 2 people in a garage to 400 employees in 11 years. Somewhere in there, we got engaged. Somewhere in there, I stopped noticing the way he talked over me in meetings. Somewhere in there, I told myself the ring on my finger meant the company was safe, because surely you don't destroy the person you're going to marry. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. The engagement ended 18 months before the heist, quietly, without a scene, the way things end when one person has already checked out emotionally and is simply waiting for the right moment to check out financially, too. I thought we could still run the company as partners, professional, mature, adults who built something bigger than a broken relationship. I didn't know he'd spent those 18 months building something too. A trap disguised as a legal formality. The day he sprang it, I called every lawyer I trusted. Every single one turned me down. The paperwork is airtight, they told me, one after another, like they were reading from the same defeated script Arthur's team had already written for them. There's nothing to fight here, Elena. I'm sorry. I sat in my empty apartment that night because, yes, he even had claim to the apartment, technically owned through a company holding account, and I stared at the wall until 3 a.m. I remember thinking, so this is it. This is how it ends. Not with a scandal, not with headlines, just paperwork, quiet and final, like a door closing softly instead of slamming. That's when a friend from law school, someone who still owed me a favor from a decade ago, said one name. Call Julian Vance. I actually laughed at the name, not because it was funny, but because Julian shared the same last name as the man who just destroyed my life. No relation, just one of those strange coincidences that make you wonder if the universe has a dark sense of humor. Julian was known in certain circles as the lawyer corporate giants feared and refused to talk about publicly. Brilliant, relentless, and depending on who you asked, a little unhinged. The kind of unhinged that comes from caring too much about justice in a system designed to reward people who don't. I met him in a cramped office above a dry cleaner in a part of the city where rent was cheap, and reputations were earned, not bought. Files were stacked to the ceiling. A cold coffee sat untouched on his desk, next to 3 empty ones. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week, and honestly, at that point, neither had I. "Tell me everything," he said, not looking up from the folder in front of him. "Don't skip the boring parts. The boring parts are usually where people hide the truth." So I told him everything. The garage, the code, the engagement, the shotgun clause, the frozen accounts, the badge that no longer worked. I talked for almost 2 hours and he didn't interrupt once except to ask every so often in this quiet, careful voice. "And then what happened? Exactly what happened, not what you think happened." When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, and for a long moment he just looked at me. "Most people in your position give up," he said. "They think airtight paperwork means the fight is over. But paperwork is written by humans, Elena. Humans make mistakes. My job is to find the one mistake that unravels everything else." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. "There's a problem," I said. "I don't have money to pay you. Arthur made sure of that." He waved a hand, dismissive, already pulling another folder toward himself. "I don't take clients who can pay easily. I take clients whose enemies think they've already won." That night, Julian started reading, and he didn't stop for 3 days. I want to describe those 3 days honestly, because they were nothing like the movies. There was no dramatic music, no lightning bolt realization in the middle of the night. Just a man in a cluttered office, surrounded by empty coffee cups and printed contracts, cross-referencing dates against digital transfer logs until his eyes were red and his handwriting on his notepad grew smaller and smaller, cramped with frustration. He called me twice a day with updates that weren't updates. Still nothing. The shotgun clause language is clean. The buyout valuation is aggressive but technically defensible. Each call chipped away a little more of the hope I was rationing like the last bit of water in a canteen. On the second night, I almost told him to stop. I remember sitting on my sister's couch, because that's where I was staying now, in her guest room, sleeping under a blanket that smelled like someone else's fabric softener. And I almost called him to say, "It's fine. Let it go. I'll start over." I didn't make that call. Something told me not to. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the memory of that security guard who wouldn't look me in the eye. Maybe some small, stubborn part of me refused to let Arthur have the last word. On the third day, Julian called at 4:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was awake, staring at the ceiling, doing the thing where you replay your worst memories on a loop until they lose all their color. My phone lit up the room, and his name flashed on the screen, and for a second I thought he was calling to say he was done, that there was nothing left to find. "Elena," his voice was different, sharper, awake in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine. "I need you to tell me something. When exactly did the company file its first provisional patent?" "Julian, it's 5 in the morning." "When, Elena? The exact month. This matters more than you know." I told him. Early on, back when we were nothing but two people and a dream and a garage that smelled like solder and instant noodles. Back before we had lawyers. Back before we had money. Back when we signed things quickly, trustingly, because we thought trust was all we needed. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear him breathing, could practically hear the gears turning in his head. "There's a document," he said slowly. "An intellectual property waiver, signed in your name. It transferred your personal rights to the early code, the foundational architecture, over to the company, back before the company was even formally incorporated. Do you remember signing it?" I sat up straight in the dark. "No," I said. "I don't remember that at all." "Think carefully, Elena. This is important." I thought back to those chaotic early months. The blur of investor calls and legal templates we barely understood. Arthur handled the administrative stuff while I focused on the code, because that's what we agreed. He managed the business side. I managed the technical side, and we trusted each other completely. "I never signed anything like that," I said, my voice quieter now, something cold crawling up my spine. "Arthur handled the IP paperwork. He said it was routine. I never even saw it." "That's what I thought," Julian said, and for the first time in 3 days, I heard something in his voice that sounded almost like excitement, carefully restrained. "Because the notarization on this document is digital, processed through a service called Swift Notary Solutions. Ever heard of it?" "No." "Nobody has. Because 8 months after this document was signed, Swift Notary Solutions had its license permanently revoked by the state for notarizing documents without verifying the actual physical presence of the signer. It was, in plain terms, a fraud mill. Every single notarization they ever processed has been retroactively invalidated in 3 separate state court rulings. Everyone. I sat in the dark, gripping my phone so hard my knuckles ached, trying to catch up to what he was telling me. "Are you saying," I said slowly, "that the waiver Arthur used to take my intellectual property was never actually valid?" "I'm saying it was never valid the moment it was created," Julian said. "Which means, legally, you never transferred your personal rights to that early code. Not to Arthur, not to the company, not to anyone." The room felt very still. "So what does that mean?" I asked, even though some part of me was already starting to understand. already starting to feel the shape of something enormous taking form in the dark. "It means," Julian said, and I could hear him smiling now, a smile with teeth in it, "that every patent this company has ever filed, every algorithm, every piece of proprietary software, every billion-dollar asset Arthur just stole from you is legally built on top of intellectual property that still belongs, personally, to you." I couldn't speak. "He didn't just cut you out of the company, Elena," Julian continued, and now he wasn't whispering anymore. Now his voice was rising with something that sounded dangerously close to joy. "He severed himself from the one person who still holds the legal rights to the technology his entire empire depends on. He fired the landlord and kept living in the house." I laughed. A real laugh this time, the first one in weeks that didn't feel like it was covering up something broken underneath. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Julian, are you completely sure? Because if we're wrong about this—" "I've cross-referenced it 4 times, he said. "State notary fraud rulings, the original IP waiver, the timeline of the company's patent filings. It all lines up. This isn't a theory, Elena. This is a fuse. We just need to decide how loud we want the explosion to be. I should tell you now, this is the point in the story where a smarter, more cautious person might have simply filed a quiet lawsuit, sent a formal notice. Let the courts grind slowly through motions and countermotions for 18 months while Arthur's lawyers build him into the ground." Julian didn't want quiet. And honestly, after everything Arthur had done, after the badge, after the frozen accounts, after the calculated cruelty of doing it all before I'd even finished my morning coffee, neither did I. "He humiliated you publicly," Julian said during one of our strategy sessions in that cramped office above the dry cleaner. "Cut off your access. Let a security guard turn you away from your own building. Let his lawyers celebrate in front of you. He wanted a show. Fine, we'll give him one." "What are you thinking?" I asked, and I remember the look on his face, calm, focused, almost gentle, which somehow made it more unsettling. "Arthur's throwing a gala," Julian said. 3 weeks from now. Launch celebration for his solo empire. Press, investors, champagne towers probably, very on brand." "How do you know that?" "Because men like Arthur can't help themselves. They need an audience for their victories. That's his weakness, Elena, not the paperwork, his ego." Julian tapped the folder on the desk between us. "We're going to let him have his party, and then we're going to end it." The next 3 weeks were the strangest of my life. On the surface, nothing seemed to be happening. Arthur's people put out a press release about restructuring for future innovation that didn't mention my name once, as if I'd simply evaporated from the company's history. Business journalists ran flattering profiles calling him a visionary who built something extraordinary, extraordinary being a word doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting. Underneath the surface, Julian was building a case with the precision of a man assembling a bomb he intended to detonate exactly once, exactly on schedule. He filed for an emergency injunction, sealed, so Arthur's team wouldn't see it coming. He coordinated quietly with federal investigators, because forged notarizations and fraudulent digital signatures, it turns out, cross the line from civil dispute into federal criminal territory very quickly. He gathered digital forensics on the original IP waiver, proving not just that the notarization was invalid, but that the signature itself had been digitally reproduced from an old email attachment I'd sent Arthur years earlier. a birthday card, of all things, that had my signature scanned at the bottom. "He used your handwriting from a birthday card," Julian told me, sliding the forensic report across the table, "to forge a document worth billions of dollars." I stared at that report for a long time. Somewhere in my chest, grief and rage were doing this strange dance, trading places every few seconds. Grief, because the man I once loved had apparently been capable of this kind of calculation for years, maybe since the very beginning. Rage, because he thought I would never find out, because he thought I was small enough, broken enough, tired enough to just disappear quietly. "Why didn't he just ask me?" I said quietly, mostly to myself. "I would have signed it. Back then, I trusted him with everything." Julian didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was gentler than I'd heard it before. "Because men like Arthur don't ask for things they can just take. Asking means acknowledging you have power over the outcome. Taking means he never has to see you as an equal." I didn't cry in that office, but it was close. The night of the gala arrived dressed in everything Arthur loved: chandeliers, string quartets, a skyline view from the top floor of a hotel he'd rented out entirely for the occasion. I watched it unfold on a live stream from Julian's office, because I refused to give Arthur the satisfaction of seeing my face in that room. Not yet, not until it mattered. He looked good, I'll admit that. Confident, rehearsed. He stood at a podium in a room full of people who owed their livelihoods, directly or indirectly, to a fortune he'd stolen from the woman who built its foundation. He raised a glass. He talked about vision and resilience, and believing in yourself even when others hold you back. And I wondered, watching him, whether he actually believed the story he was telling, or whether he'd simply told it so many times that the lie had become load-bearing. "In every great success," Arthur said, his voice smooth and practiced, "there comes a moment where you have to choose between loyalty to the past and loyalty to the future. I chose the future." The room applauded. Somewhere in that crowd, cameras flashed. Champagne flowed. And exactly 4 minutes into his speech, the doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Julian walked in first. Behind him, 2 federal marshals in plain clothes, moving with the unhurried calm of people who have done this before and know exactly how it ends. The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when everyone senses something wrong before they understand what it is. Arthur's smile faltered, just slightly, just enough. "Arthur Vance," Julian said, his voice carrying easily across the stunned silence. "I'm serving you with an emergency federal cease and desist order, effective immediately, prohibiting the use, licensing, or transfer of any intellectual property currently held by your company." "What is this?" Arthur said, laughing in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Get security. Get someone to escort this man out." "I'd also like to introduce you," Julian continued, unbothered, pulling a folder from his coat, "to the results of a forensic investigation into a fraudulently notarized intellectual property waiver, dated to your company's earliest funding round, submitted to your legal team and to the Department of Justice this morning." I watched Arthur's face through the live stream feed, watched confidence curdle into confusion in real time. "This is absurd," he said, but his voice had lost its polish. "Whatever you think you found, my legal team will tear it apart in an hour." "Your legal team," Julian said, "already knows. I sent them the forensic report 40 minutes ago along with the injunction. That's why 3 of them just left through the side exit instead of standing next to you right now. Arthur looked to his left, to his right. For the first time in the entire live stream, I saw him actually search the room for support and come up empty. "Here's what's happening in real time, Arthur," Julian said, and now his voice had that dangerous calm I'd heard once before, in the office above the dry cleaner. "Your company's entire technology stack, every patent, every algorithm, every proprietary system your empire runs on, was built on intellectual property that was never legally transferred to you. It still belongs, personally, to Elena Vance. As of this morning, a federal judge has agreed there's sufficient evidence of fraud to freeze all corporate assets pending investigation. Your servers are being flagged. Your banking partners have already received notice. And every dollar in your offshore accounts is now formally classified as proceeds derived from active intellectual property theft." I watched through a grainy live stream on a laptop in a cramped office above a dry cleaner as Arthur Vance's entire world came apart in under 90 seconds, in front of the very people he'd invited to witness his triumph. "This is a mistake," Arthur said, but nobody in that room was looking at him with sympathy anymore. They were looking at him the way you look at a building you just realized is on fire. "There's no mistake here except the one you made 9 years ago," Julian said, "when you decided a forged signature was easier than a conversation with your partner." I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment. Mostly, I felt tired. Tired in a way that went all the way down to my bones. Because winning didn't undo the months of humiliation, or the nights on my sister's couch, or the badge that stopped working, or the years I'd spent loving someone who saw me as an obstacle to remove rather than a person to respect. But underneath the exhaustion, something else was there too. Something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like standing on solid ground. The boardroom meeting happened 4 days later, in a room I once considered mine. Arthur sat across the table, his lawyers reduced from a small army to 2 exhausted associates who kept glancing at the door like they wanted permission to leave. Julian sat beside me, calm, patient, letting silence do a lot of the work that silence is good at doing to guilty men. "We can settle this quietly," Arthur said, and there was something almost pleading in his voice now, a tone I'd never heard from him before, not once in 9 years. "Elena, we built this together. We can still find a way." "You had a way," I said. "You had a conversation, you had honesty, you chose forgery instead." He looked down at the table. For a moment, just a moment, I almost felt something like pity. Almost. "The offer," Julian said, sliding a document across the table, "is full and immediate transfer of 100% ownership back to Elena. Full restitution of frozen personal accounts with interest. And full cooperation with the Department of Justice regarding the forged notarization and subsequent fraud. In exchange, we won't pursue additional civil damages beyond restitution." "And if I refuse?" Arthur asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "Then we proceed with the criminal referral already sitting with federal prosecutors," Julian said. "And you can explain to a jury why you forged your ex-fiancé's signature on a birthday card to steal a technology empire." Arthur signed the papers. His hand shook just slightly on the last signature, the one that mattered most. In the weeks that followed, The story became public in the way these things always do, in pieces, then all at once. Reporters who once called Arthur a visionary now call him a case study in corporate fraud. The Department of Justice opened a formal criminal investigation. And given the digital forensics Julian had built, given the trail of falsified documents and fabricated notarizations, most legal analysts agreed Arthur was looking at real prison time, not the kind wealthy men usually negotiate their way around. I rebuilt the company slowly, carefully, this time surrounded by people who'd earned my trust instead of assuming it. I changed the corporate bylaws myself, personally, closing every loophole a shotgun clause could ever hide inside again. Some nights, I still catch myself flinching at the sound of a phone ringing too early in the morning, an old wound that hasn't quite finished healing. Julian and I still talk, not as client and lawyer anymore. That chapter closed the day Arthur signed those papers, but as two people who went through something enormous together and came out the other side changed by it. He told me once, over coffee, in an actual clean office he'd finally upgraded to, that the case had stayed with him longer than most. Not because it was complicated, he said, because it was almost perfect. One tiny mistake, buried 9 years deep, and it was the only thread that mattered. I think about that a lot, how something so small, an automated signature on a piece of paper nobody bothered to double-check, became the exact thing that unraveled an empire built on betrayal. Arthur, last I heard, is awaiting sentencing. His remaining assets, the ones not already seized as proceeds of fraud, are being liquidated to cover restitution and legal fees. The gala footage still circulates online sometimes. That exact moment, his composure cracked in real time, dissected and mocked by strangers who never knew either of us, who only know the 90 seconds where everything he built came apart. People ask me if I forgive him. I don't have a clean answer for that. Some days I think forgiveness is something you do for yourself, a way of setting down a weight you're tired of carrying. Other days, I think some betrayals are simply too calculated, too deliberate, too patient, to deserve a word as generous as forgiveness. What I do know is this: Arthur spent years believing that paperwork was more powerful than partnership, that a forged signature could quietly erase 9 years of shared work, shared trust, shared history. He believed the system would protect him because he understood its language better than I did. He forgot one thing: systems built on lies eventually collapse under their own weight. It just takes someone patient enough and angry enough to find the crack. So here's the question I keep sitting with, the one I don't think has a clean answer. Arthur built an empire on a small, calculated act of betrayal nobody was ever supposed to find, and he still would have gotten away with all of it, if not for pure luck disguised as diligence. If Julian hadn't asked that one specific question at 4:47 in the morning, Arthur would still be at that gala tonight, champagne in hand, calling himself a visionary. Does justice really mean anything if it only happens to arrive by accident?